Even in the deepest hours of the night, when most of the lights in the apartment windows had gone dark and the restaurants had pulled down their shutters, the city still breathed. Neon signs buzzed against wet pavement. Delivery trucks rolled down empty avenues. Security guards stood at the doors of tall buildings, shifting their weight from foot to foot, blowing warm air into their cold hands. Valcrest was the kind of city that had too much going on to ever fully close its eyes, and on this particular night, a Tuesday, in the middle of a cold and unforgiving autumn, the rain had been falling for 6 straight hours without any sign of stopping. The rain came down hard and sideways, pushed by a wind that had no patience for anything standing in its way. It rattled the iron fences along the Northern District roads. It flooded the gutters on the corner of Merrick Avenue and turned the old cobblestones near the port into a shallow river of dark water. It soaked through newspaper left on doorsteps, and it collected in the broken places of the sidewalks that the city had never bothered to fix. It was not a gentle rain. It was not the kind of rain that people wrote poems about. It was the kind of rain that made you feel, deep in your chest, that the world was simply cold and wet and did not care very much about the people moving through it. And yet, moving through it, or rather trying to, was a young man named Ren Solano. He was 26 years old, though he looked older in the way that people look older when life has taken more from them than it has given back. He was not a very tall man, and he was thin in a way that was not natural, in a way that did not come from choice or from the way his body was built, but from weeks and weeks of not having enough to eat. His face was pale in the lamplight, drained of color the way a piece of paper goes pale when it has been left out in the rain too long. His dark hair was soaking wet and pressed flat against his forehead. His clothes, a worn gray long-sleeve shirt and a pair of trousers that were slightly too big for him now, were completely drenched through to his skin. He had no jacket, he had no bag, he had no phone in his pocket, he had no shoes on his feet. His bare feet moved across the cold, wet pavement with a slowness that was not calm, but exhausted. Every step he took was an argument with his own body, a negotiation between the part of him that wanted desperately to keep moving and the part of him that had simply run out of fuel. His legs were shaking, not trembling the way legs tremble when someone is nervous or cold, but shaking from the very center, the way a machine shakes when it is running on empty and the gears are beginning to grind against each other. He had been walking for a very long time. He did not know exactly how long. Time had become strange to him in the last several hours. It stretched and compressed without warning, and the only thing that felt real anymore was the cold and the sound of the rain and the distant blurry lights ahead of him. He did not know where he was going. He had stopped knowing that about 2 hours ago. When he had run, the third time, the last time, the only time he had made it far enough to feel the open air on his face and know that no one was immediately behind him, he had simply gone forward. He had not planned a destination because there was no destination to plan. There was no apartment to return to, no family home waiting with a warm light in the window, no friend whose door he could knock on without putting that friend in danger. He had nothing and no one, and so he had gone forward, and forward led him here, to the northern district of Valcrest, where the buildings were taller and the streets were quieter, and the doors were heavier and more serious-looking than anywhere he had ever been allowed to walk before. He passed a street light, and his shadow stretched long behind him for a moment, before the darkness swallowed it again. He passed a black iron gate and a row of thick hedges trimmed into perfect rectangles. He turned a corner, and then his legs stopped working. It was not a decision. It was not a choice. His body simply reached the end of what it was able to do and submitted, the way a candle submits when the wax is gone, not dramatically, not with a fight, but with a quiet, helpless surrender. His knees buckled first. His hands came forward and caught the stone steps in front of him, scraping against the wet surface, and for one moment he was on his hands and knees at the base of a short staircase leading up to a tall black door. Then even his arms gave out, and he went down the rest of the way, his cheek pressing against the cold, wet stone of the bottom step, the rain continuing to fall on him without any ceremony or sympathy. He closed his eyes. Inside the tall black building, a private residence that occupied the entire top 3 floors above a secured ground-level entrance, there were 4 men awake, as they very often were at this hour, because the kind of lives they led did not lend themselves easily to early bedtimes. This building was their home base, their private territory, and it was known in certain circles of the city as a place that very serious people did not approach without a very good reason and a very polite tone. The 4 men who lived and worked here were not criminals in the simple, careless sense of the word. They were powerful, organized, deeply connected, and they had their own code, a set of rules they lived by that had nothing to do with the rules printed in government books and everything to do with loyalty, respect, and the particular kind of justice that exists in the spaces between official laws. Their names were Dante Reyes, Marco Reyes, Leon Ashford, and Cale Voss. Dante was 30, and he was the oldest of the 4, the one who made the final decisions, the one whose voice carried the most weight in a room. He was currently sitting at a long table covered with documents, a cold cup of coffee at his elbow, reading through pages of information about a business negotiation that had gone sideways earlier in the week. He read carefully and slowly, making small marks in the margins with a pen. He was the kind of man who did not rush, because he had learned long ago that rushing was how people missed important things. Marco was 29, Dante's younger brother, and he was in the kitchen, not because he was hungry, but Marco had a habit of making things when he was restless, and he had been restless all evening over a matter that had not yet resolved itself. He was making a pot of something, warm, stirring it slowly and listening to the sound of the rain against the kitchen window, with a small frown on his face, the way a person frowns when the weather outside matches a feeling they can't quite name. Leon was 28, the quietest and most precise of the 4, and he was in his study with 3 screens open, running through the kind of background research that Leon did better than anyone else in the city. Leon had a talent, a genuine, remarkable talent for finding connections between things that appeared to have no connection at all, for pulling a single thread and following it until the whole picture came apart and showed him what was hiding underneath. He was following such a thread, too, though it had not yet led him to anywhere of importance, not yet. Cale was 27, the youngest, and Cale did what Cale did when everyone else was busy, and he had nothing specific assigned to him. He was walking, not inside the long hallways of the building, back and forth, hands in his pockets, his mind turning over thoughts the way hands turn over stones at the edge of a river, restless and searching.
Cale felt things more immediately than the other 3. When something was wrong, he felt it first in his chest before he had any logical reason to believe something was wrong. The others respected this about him, even when it was inconvenient. He was on his 4th pass down the main hallway when he stopped. He stood very still. He had heard something, or not quite heard it, sensed it, the way you sense a change in the air before you can explain why the air feels different. He walked to the front entrance, put his hand on the heavy door, and paused for just a second before he opened it. The rain came in immediately, cold and sharp and immediate, and Cale looked down and saw Wren. For a moment he simply stood there, the rain hitting his face and the top of his shoulders, looking at this person who had collapsed on their front steps in the middle of the night with no shoes and no coat and no color left in his face. Then he crouched down and put 2 fingers gently against the side of Wren's neck and felt a pulse, present but thin and too fast, and he stood back up and shouted with no softness at all into the building behind him. All 3 of the others came within 30 seconds. Dante saw the situation in one sweeping look and made an immediate decision without discussion. Marco was already moving to help lift Wren carefully from the cold stone. Leon had his phone out before anyone asked him to, calling the private doctor who had been on their contact list for 3 years and had always answered on the second ring. Cale stayed closest to Wren, one hand resting very lightly on the young man's back, watching the shallow rise and fall of his breathing with an expression on his face that was somewhere between fury and something much more fragile. They brought Ren inside. They laid him on the long couch in the main room, turned the heating up to its highest setting, and the doctor arrived in 22 minutes, examined Ren thoroughly, and reported her findings to Dante in a calm, professional voice that did not make the findings feel any less serious. Ren was severely malnourished, not from a few missed meals or from poverty alone. This was the kind of nutritional deficiency that built up over weeks of deliberate, sustained restriction. His body temperature was dangerously low. He had minor injuries on his feet from walking on pavement without shoes. He would recover, the doctor said, but recovery would take time and consistent care and food, real food in real amounts, given regularly. After the doctor left, the four men stood in the main room and looked at the sleeping figure of a stranger who had come out of the night and fallen on their steps, and no one said anything for a long moment. It was Marco who finally moved. He went to the kitchen and came back with a warm cloth and a glass of water and set them on the table beside the couch. He pulled a chair over and sat down close to where Ren was sleeping, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and stayed there, not asking anything, not expecting anything, just staying. The others drifted back to what they had been doing, but none of them went to sleep, and none of them went very far. When Ren opened his eyes in the early gray light of the morning, the first thing he saw was an unfamiliar ceiling. The second thing he saw was Marco Reyes, sitting in a chair beside him, awake, looking at him with an expression of calm and steady attention. Ren startled and tried to sit up too fast, and his body immediately reminded him of what condition it was in by sending a wave of dizziness through him so strong that he had to close his eyes again and breathe slowly until it passed. Marco did not reach out to grab him or restrain him. He simply said, very gently, "Easy. You are safe here. You have been sleeping for about 6 hours." Ren opened his eyes again and looked at Marco, and then looked around the room, at the warm interior, the high ceilings, the low lamp still burning in the corner, the blanket over him, the glass of water on the table. He looked back at Marco and said, in a voice that was rough from disuse and sickness, that he was sorry for being a problem, that he would leave immediately, that he did not want to cause any trouble for anyone. Marco shook his head slowly. He said, "You are not a problem, you are a person, and you are not going anywhere until you have eaten something, and we know you are safe." Ren stared at him for a long moment, as if the words were in a language he almost recognized but could not quite translate. Then Kale appeared in the doorway, and behind him Leon, and a few seconds later Dante came and stood at the edge of the room. 4 men of varying heights and expressions, all looking at Ren with the same underlying message in their eyes, which was that none of them were going to let him leave into the cold morning without knowing what had happened to him. Kale crouched down so that he was at eye level with Ren and asked his question, the one that Ren had not been asked in a very long time by anyone who actually wanted to know the answer. "Who did this to you?" Ren looked at the floor. He shook his head. He said it did not matter. He said no one would believe him. And Marco went to the kitchen and came back with a bowl of warm rice porridge with a soft boiled egg resting on top of it, and he put it in Ren's hands and sat back down in his chair and said nothing at all. He did not ask Ren to talk. He did not ask Ren to explain himself. He just sat there, present and unhurried, while Ren looked at the bowl in his hands, at food that someone had made for him, that was warm and smelled real, and was being given freely, without conditions attached, and the tears came slowly, silently, in the way that tears come when a person has been holding something back for so long that the smallest act of kindness breaks the seal entirely. No one in the room looked away, and no one made Ren feel ashamed of crying. Dante stood at the edge of the room and watched all of this and said nothing, but somewhere behind his serious, steady expression, a decision was being made, quiet and absolute, the way all of Dante's most important decisions were made, and by the time Ren had finished his porridge and the morning had grown fully light, that decision was already complete. They would find out who did this to him, and when they did, the entire city of Valcrest would know about it.
The days that followed moved at two different speeds. For Ren, they moved slowly, gently even, in a way that felt strange and slightly unreal, like being wrapped in something warm after spending so long in the cold that you have forgotten what warmth feels like, and your body does not entirely trust it yet. He slept more than he had slept in months. He ate small meals that Marco prepared with the kind of quiet, focused care that some people bring to things they consider important. He spent long hours sitting by the window in the main room, watching the rain continue to fall over the city below, saying very little, the blanket still around his shoulders, his dark eyes tracking the movement of the streets with the particular attention of someone who spent a long time learning to notice exits and entrances and who was standing where. He was healing. That much was visible. The color had begun to return to his face. His hands had stopped shaking by the third day. He walked to the kitchen and back on his own without having to hold the walls. But healing was not the same as being whole, and anyone who looked carefully at Ren Solano could see that there was a space inside him where something had been taken, something slow and difficult to name, something that had to do with trust and safety and the basic belief that the world had room in it for him. For the other four men, those same days moved quickly, with the sharp, purposeful speed of people who had identified a problem and were now systematically working towards solving it. Dante moved through the information about Ren's condition the way he moved through all problems, methodically, without wasted emotion, constructing a picture from available facts before drawing any conclusions. Marco divided his attention between watching over Ren and helping gather whatever Dante needed, which was the way Marco had always worked, with one hand on the people he loved and one hand on the work that needed doing. Cale burned with a contained and focused anger that he channeled into action, running down contacts and pulling on connections in the city that others did not have. And Leon followed the thread. It was Leon who found it first. On the fourth evening, while Ren was asleep and the building had gone quiet, Leon came to Dante's study and placed a single printed photograph on the desk. It was a close-up image, not taken by Leon himself, but found in a city registry database that he had accessed through a channel that existed in that gray space between official and unofficial. The image showed a mark, a small set of numbers tattooed in pale ink on the inner wrist of a registered individual in a city welfare program. Leon had seen the same mark on Ren's wrist on the first morning, when Ren had pushed the blanket back to drink his water and the sleeve of his borrowed shirt had shifted slightly. The mark belonged to an organization called the Fane Omega Welfare Initiative. It was run by a man named Director Hugo Fane. Dante looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. Then he said one word, a name, and Leon nodded once, slowly, and set a second printed document on the desk. This one contained the official public profile of Director Hugo Fane. 61 years old, described in city records as a philanthropist and social program administrator, the founder of 3 registered welfare initiatives serving vulnerable populations in Valcrest. His photograph showed a heavy-set man with white hair and a wide, practiced smile, the kind of smile that existed for photographs and presentations and public ceremonies, the kind that never quite reached the eyes. The investigation that followed was thorough and methodical. Leon worked through city records and financial documents. Dante used his network of trusted contacts, people who owed him favors or who simply respected him enough to share what they knew. Marco found 3 former residents of Hugo's program who had managed to leave over the past 2 years, and he met each of them carefully, separately, in places where they felt safe, and he listened to what they had to say without interrupting and without pushing. Cale tracked the physical locations connected to Hugo's organization, the registered address, the satellite facilities, the building permits, the supply contracts, and what he found when he laid all of it out on a map was a pattern that looked from the outside like a welfare network and felt from the inside like something built entirely around control. The picture that emerged was this. Hugo Fane's program had, on paper, a generous and straightforward mission,
to provide housing, food, income, and community support to adult Omegas in Valcrest who had no family connections and no financial stability. In a city where Omegas without family backing were statistically the most vulnerable population, this kind of program appeared not just useful, but necessary. And for the first several years of its existence, it perhaps functioned with some degree of genuine intention. But somewhere along the way, slowly, incrementally, through small decisions that each seemed manageable and reasonable on their own, Hugo Fane had built something else. Something that used the appearance of care as a front for extraction. The Omegas in Hugo's program worked. They cleaned Hugo's commercial properties, staffed his catering operations, maintained the facilities of his business partners. The work was framed as part of their rehabilitation and integration, a way of building skills and stability. In reality, the Omegas received almost none of the income generated by their labor. What they received instead was housing, shared, cramped, locked at night, and food, which was carefully controlled and used as the primary instrument of compliance. Those who worked without complaint and asked no questions ate adequately. Those who raised concerns, who attempted contact with outsiders, who pushed against the boundaries of the program, found their portions reduced, systematically, deliberately. Starvation was not an accident in Hugo Fane's program. It was a management technique.
Leon presented all of this to the others on the fifth evening, laid out across the long dining table in a series of organized documents, maps, and financial records. Dante stood at the head of the table with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Marco leaned forward with both hands flat on the table, reading every page twice. Kyle stood at the far end with his jaw set and his hands very still at his sides, very still in the specific way of someone who is working hard to keep them still. Ren was in the room. They had asked him to be there. They had asked because it was his story, and they believed he deserved to be in the room when it was told. He sat in a chair slightly to the side of the table, and as Leon walked through the information piece by piece, Ren's expression did not change dramatically. He did not look shocked. He looked instead like someone hearing a detailed description of something they had lived. The particular expression of recognition and relief and grief that comes when the truth of your experience is finally laid out in front of you in a form that cannot be argued with or dismissed. Someone had believed him enough to find the proof. The proof existed. He had not been imagining it, and he had not been exaggerating it, and he had not been too weak or too foolish to understand what was happening to him. When Leon finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Dante looked at Ren and spoke carefully and directly, the way Dante always spoke, without decoration or softening, but with a precision that Ren was already beginning to understand meant respect rather than coldness. He told Ren what they had found. He told him that they believed everything. He told him that there were at least 47 other names in the records connected to Hugo's program, and that every one of those people mattered. And Kyle, who had been silent the whole time, said in a voice that was very controlled, "Tell us what you know." Ren looked at him. He looked around the table at all four of them, and then, for the first time, he began to talk. He talked for a long time. He told them about the layout of the main facility on Clover Street, the dormitory floors, the supply rooms, the locked corridors that were locked from the outside, not the inside. He told them about the meal schedule and how it worked, and how Nurse Talia Mord managed the punishment system with a smile and a clipboard. He told them about the record room on the second floor, a locked room he had only seen the inside of once when he was brought there to sign an updated contract, and where he had noticed in the few minutes he had been allowed to stand there, filing cabinets, and a large desktop computer, and a shelf of physical ledgers with dates written on their spines going back 6 years. He told them about his 3 attempts to leave. The first 2 had ended within 2 blocks of the building. Hugo had a network of people in the surrounding neighborhood who reported back to him, residents and shopkeepers who had been given small incentives to watch for people leaving on foot without permission.
The third time, Ren had gone at 3 in the morning through a bathroom window on the ground floor that had a broken latch that maintenance had not fixed in 6 weeks. He had known about the broken latch for a month. He had spent that month waiting and observing and preparing, eating every meal he was given without protest to make sure his body had as much in it as possible for the attempt, mapping the route in his mind every night before he slept. He had made it 4 kilometers before his legs gave out on the steps of a building in the northern district. When he finished, Marco looked at him for a long moment and then said very simply, "You are one of the smartest and bravest people I have ever met." Ren looked slightly startled by this, as if bravery and intelligence were words that had not been applied to him before, or had not been applied in a long time, and hearing them felt like putting on a coat you had forgotten you owned. Dante was already thinking ahead. Leon was already taking notes. Kyle was already looking at the map of the Clover Street facility that was spread open on the table. And then Ren said something that changed the dynamic of the room entirely. He said, "I can help. I know where he keeps his real records. I know the room. I know the schedule of the building. I know which door has a 2-second delay on the alarm system because the sensor was installed wrong and never corrected." He paused. "If you are going in, you need me." The 4 men looked at him, not with surprise exactly, with something closer to recognition, the acknowledgement of a person stepping fully into their own capability, claiming their own place in the story that had been done to them, and deciding firmly that they would also be the person who helped end it. Dante nodded once. "Then you are part of this," he said.
The plan took 4 days to build and was constructed with the same precision that Leon brought to everything, layer by layer, each piece fitting against the next, contingencies prepared for contingencies, nothing left to chance that could be controlled, and nothing wasted on anger that should be spent on accuracy. This was the tension at the heart of those 4 days. The urgency of knowing that 47 people were still inside that building on Clover Street, still eating reduced portions, still locked in at night, still smiling carefully at Nurse Talia Mord to avoid further punishment, and the discipline required to act correctly rather than act immediately. Cale struggled most visibly with this discipline. He was not a person built for waiting when someone was being hurt. He paced, he argued for moving sooner, he pushed back against Leon's careful timelines with the blunt energy of someone who finds patience genuinely painful. And it was Ren, in the end, who settled him, not with an argument, not with logic, but by sitting down beside him one evening and saying quietly, "Every time I tried to leave too fast, I ended up back inside. The third time worked because I waited until everything was ready. Waiting is not the same as doing nothing. Waiting is how we make sure it works." Cale looked at him for a long moment and then exhaled slowly and sat back in his chair, and he did not argue about the timeline again. The plan had 4 moving parts, one for each of them. Leon's part was information and documentation. He had identified 2 investigative journalists, both of whom had previously reported on Valcrest's social welfare sector, and 1 city official with a clean record and a known personal commitment to protecting vulnerable populations. Leon prepared 3 separate evidence packages, each containing copies of the financial records he had already obtained through remote access, along with affidavits from the 3 former program residents that Marco had spoken to previously. These packages were not sent immediately. They were prepared, sealed, and held in readiness, set to be delivered simultaneously at a specific moment during the operation. Marco's part was logistics and safety. He secured a large, clean facility in the Eastern District, a building owned by a contact who owed Marco a favor and asked no questions, and arranged for it to be stocked with food, beds, medical supplies, and the presence of 2 trusted medical professionals. This would be the temporary safe housing for the residents of Hugo's program once the operation was complete. Marco coordinated quietly, moving pieces into place over the course of 3 days without drawing attention.
Cale's part was disruption. On the evening of the operation, 3 of Hugo's key business partners, the ones whose names appeared most frequently in the financial records as the direct beneficiaries of the unpaid labor from his program, would each receive an anonymous package at their personal addresses. These packages contained specific, detailed financial documentation linking them directly to Hugo's operation, not accusations, not suggestions, but transaction records, contracts, and communications that were difficult to misread. The goal was not to destroy them immediately, but to fracture Hugo's network of support at the exact moment he needed it most, forcing him to manage multiple emergencies simultaneously rather than focusing his attention on his own building. And Dante's part was the door. He would go in directly, openly, without disguise or misdirection, because Dante Reyes walking through a door with a certain expression on his face was a communication that most people in Valcrest understood immediately and clearly. His presence would draw Hugo's attention to the front of the building and hold it there. While Hugo focused on the front of the building, while his attention and his people moved towards the main entrance and the presence of Dante Reyes, Ren and Leon came through the side entrance on the eastern face of the facility, the one with the 2-second alarm delay on the sensor, the one Ren knew. They moved fast and quiet through the ground floor corridor, up the back staircase and on to the second floor. Leon worked on the lock of the record room with a calm efficiency that suggested he had done this kind of thing before. Ren stood beside him and watched the corridor with steady eyes. The door opened in 90 seconds. Inside, the record room was exactly as Ren had described it: filing cabinets, a desktop computer, a shelf of dated ledgers. Leon began immediately, plugging in his drive, pulling files, copying everything with a methodical speed that looked unhurried but covered ground at a remarkable rate. Ren moved to the filing cabinets and began finding the physical records that Leon identified verbally: the ledgers, the specific contract folders, the punishment logs that Hugo had apparently been keeping in his own hand for 6 years. Ren handled each document carefully and precisely, as someone handles something that represents both a wound and a weapon. They were in the room for 11 minutes.
When they came out with everything, Cale was already at the back of staircase waiting for them, his disruption work done, the packages delivered, and himself arrived at the building on a timeline they had agreed on in advance. He fell into step beside Ren without a word, one hand briefly on Ren's shoulder, a quick, firm contact that communicated both relief and resolve, and the 3 of them moved toward the exit. They did not make it to the exit before Hugo Fane found them. He appeared at the end of the corridor with 3 of his people flanking him, his broad face red with effort and anger, his white hair slightly disheveled from the speed with which he had moved through his own building. He looked at Leon and Cale with the blank assessment of a man who recognized a threat, and then his eyes moved to Ren, and something shifted in his face, something cold and sharp and ugly, the expression of a person who believed completely that they owned what was in front of them and could not process evidence to the contrary. He looked at Ren and smiled. It was the same practiced smile from his public photographs, but stripped now of its function: no camera, no audience, no need for performance. And what was left underneath it was very small and very mean. He said to Ren in the voice of a person who had said similar things many times before to people who had nowhere to go, "Who is going to believe a nobody like you?" And the corridor went very quiet. Ren stood between Leon and Cale, and he looked at Hugo Fane, and he did not look afraid. He did not look small. He looked like someone who had walked 4 kilometers in the cold with no shoes and no food because he refused to stop, and who had survived, and who was standing now in the one place he had been trying to reach for a year, the place on the other side of that building's control, and who had 4 people standing with him and a drive full of proof in Leon's pocket and 47 names in those files and a city official who would have an evidence package in his hands within the hour. He said, steadily and clearly, You do not need to believe only me. There are 47 other people whose names are in those files. Every one of them has a story exactly like mine, and every single one of them is going to be asked to tell it." Hugo's smile did not disappear immediately. It faded, slowly, the way confidence fades when the evidence against it becomes too heavy to ignore. And in the space where the smile had been was something much smaller, the expression of a man who has just understood that the ground under his feet has already shifted and that nothing he does in the next few minutes will shift it back. Dante appeared at the far end of the corridor. He had heard the voices. He had moved. He stood at one end of the corridor, and Kale and Leon and Ren stood at the other, and Hugo Fane stood in the middle, and the three people flanking Hugo looked at Dante and then looked at each other, and quietly, one by one, made the decision that this particular loyalty was not worth what it was about to cost them. Hugo Fane was taken into custody by the city authorities at 11:43 that same night. The official call had been made by the city official who received Leon's evidence package, who had read enough of it in the first 20 minutes to understand what he was looking at and moved with remarkable speed. Nurse Talia Mord, when approached separately the following morning, chose cooperation immediately, demonstrating, among other things, that her loyalty to Hugo Fane had always been contingent on his ability to protect her from consequences, and that this ability had now expired. The 47 residents of the Clover Street facility were moved to the Eastern District Safe House in the early hours of the morning, transported by the logistics that Marco had spent 3 days putting in place. Marco was there when the vehicles arrived, standing at the entrance of the building with the lights on and the door open, directing people inside, making sure everyone had something warm to eat and somewhere to sit, and someone to talk to who would listen without rushing them. He stayed there through the rest of the night and into the next morning, because Marco Reyes understood in a very practical way that the rescue is not over when the door opens. The rescue is over when the people inside know they are genuinely safe. The two journalists who received Leon's evidence packages published their investigations within 72 hours of each other. The financial records were clear, and the testimony of former residents was detailed and specific. The Clover Street Welfare Initiative was formally suspended pending full investigation within 4 days of the operation. The 3 business partners who had received Kale's anonymous packages found themselves facing separate financial inquiries that absorbed their full attention, as intended. Hugo's broader network of influence in Valcrest, which had been built over years of careful relationship management and strategic favor-giving, began to dissolve with a speed that reflected how dependent it had always been on his ability to avoid exactly this kind of scrutiny. The system did not fall because 4 powerful men decided to burn it down in anger. It fell because a young man had survived something terrible and told the truth about it to people who listened, and those people had been disciplined enough to build the kind of case that could not be argued with or managed or quietly reassembled after the moment of crisis passed. That distinction mattered. Leon was clear about this from the beginning, and the outcome proved him right. When justice is built on solid ground, on documentation, testimony, coordinated exposure, and legitimate authority, it does not give the people who caused harm an easy way to recover from it. Hugo Fane had no evidence to refute, no process to challenge, no version of events to offer that contradicted the records he wrote himself. He had built his operation on paper because paper was how he managed and controlled it, and that same paper now built the walls around him. In the weeks that followed, the city of Valcrest had a great deal to discuss. The story was everywhere, in the news, in conversations, in the kinds of difficult community meetings where people who had been looking away from something uncomfortable were asked to look directly at it. It was not a comfortable story. It required people to ask questions about how Hugo's program had operated openly for 6 years without enough people looking closely enough at what was actually inside it. It required the city to reckon with the fact that a structure designed to help vulnerable people had been allowed to become a structure that controlled and exploited them, and that this had happened in plain sight, and that the official systems intended to prevent exactly this kind of harm had not caught it. Those were important questions. They were not easy questions, but they were the right ones, and the fact that the city was asking them, publicly, with the discomfort and friction that real accountability requires, was the beginning of something better than what had been there before. The Clover program was rebuilt from nothing by a committee that included notably 3 Omega representatives who had experienced the welfare system from the inside and whose voices had significant weight in every decision made about the new structure. Real oversight, real food, real freedom to leave, real records kept by multiple independent parties. Real people at the center of it, not as labor to be managed, but as people to be genuinely supported. And in the tall black building in the northern district of Valcrest, on an evening several weeks after all of this had begun, Ren Solano sat at the long dining table with 4 men who had found him on their steps and decided, without being asked, that he mattered. The meal that Marco had made was warm and generous. The conversation moved at its own easy pace, Kale talking about something that frustrated him earlier in the day, Leon making a dry comment that made Dante's mouth curve upward in the slight way that served as his version of a laugh, Ren listening and then adding something quietly that turned out to be funnier than expected and made everyone at the table genuinely smile. Outside, the rain, which had been threatening all evening, had chosen that particular moment to begin again, falling on the city of Valcrest the way rain always falls, without preference or performance, landing equally on the old broken places and the new ones, on everything that had ended and everything that is, slowly and with great effort and with the help of people who chose each other, beginning. If this story moved you, if you felt something in Ren's silence, or in the moment those 4 men opened the door without asking questions first, then this community is exactly where you belong. Like this video, subscribe and hit the bell, drop a comment, share this video with someone who loves a powerful story about loyalty, found family, and the kind of people who show up when it matters most. Every view, every like, every comment, and every subscriber helps this channel grow and allows us to keep telling stories that matter. Thank you for being here. We will see you in the next one.